Yeah. Okay. All right. This week's Sedra is Parshas Noach. Everybody knows what Parshas Noach is about. The Mabul, the flood that destroyed all of mankind, with the exception of Noach and his family. Maybe one or two other exceptions, according to various midrashim. But the question is, but toward the end of the Sedra, and the reason the Mabul took place, the flood, because God said he couldn't reside together with man anymore, because man was doing everything that was wrong, and the flood, God felt it was necessary to destroy mankind. At the end of the Sedra, however, we see that all of mankind, in a sense, unites, but does not unite for the proper purpose. It unites in a rebellion against God. They build a migdal, a big tower, according to Medrashim. I don't know if the Medrash has to be taken literally. They were going to wage war, use the migdal to wage war against God. But the question is, at the time of the Dor Haflaga, the generation of the migdal that built the tower, that was a symbol of rebellion against God. So at that time, Noach was still alive. Avram at that time was 48 years old. There are midrashim that say that Avram was 3 years old at the time that he came to recognize God, and there are midrashim that say that he was 40 years old. There are those that say that emotionally he sensed there was a God at 3, but intellectually he understood of God's existence at the age of 40. I think a simpler answer might be, because the word hikir, we say Abram was the first one to recognize God. We know there was Noach, there was Shem. In other words, the word hikir, to recognize God, does not necessarily have to be understood only in the sense of personal recognition. But hikir as boro could also mean to go and to spread about God's existence, about God's control of the world, about God being the king of all existence and being the creator. So we could suggest that at the age of 3, Abraham began to realize the existence of God, in spite of the fact that he lived in a society that was involved in idolatry. But at the age of 40, he went out. He started spreading about God. According to some of the midrashim, the whole episode of the Kivshan Aish, of Avram being thrown into the furnace, that was perhaps when he was not yet even bar mitzvah. So Avram at that point, at the point of the rebellion against God, of the Dor Haflaga. So Avram was 48 years old. He was already a person that would go out and, in a sense, try to teach the world about God. And certainly they reminded the people, whether it was Noach or it was Avram or it was Shem, would remind the people about the flood, about the Mabul. So how is it that, certainly from the perspective of the situation in those years, The Ramban said that at that time, before the Mabul, that was the general rule, that people lived very long lives. The Rambam says there were exceptions. Those who lived very long lives were the exception, not the rule. But certainly, according to the Ramban, the rule was that people before the Mabul lived long lives. So they certainly were aware of the Mabul. So how is it that in spite of the Mabul, in spite of the flood, they thought that they could start a rebellion against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, against God? Now, after the flood takes place, after the flood, and Avram comes out and he builds a mizbeach, builds an altar, and he gives sacrifices to God, and God assures him that he will never destroy the world again, and he designates the rainbow.
Noach, not Avram,
Noach, I'm sorry. Noach designates the rainbow as the symbol of God designates the rainbow as the symbol of the covenant that he made with Noach, together with all of mankind, of all future generations. But shortly afterwards, Noach becomes a farmer. And what does he plant? He plants grapes, a vine. And he makes wine from the grapes, and he becomes drunk. And he, in his tent, he undresses himself, he's naked, and then Chum and Canaan, to a certain degree, they make fun of Noach, and they might have done other things, the Medrash says, and then Noach, when he comes out of his drunken state, he realizes what Chum and Canaan did to him. So he curses them that their descendants should be slaves. But the vine that he planted, that was the source of these problems. Where did that vine come from? Rashi says Noach had it in the Teva, and he brought it with him from the Teva, from the ark. It was sort of like a preparation. The Zohar mentions different opinions. He mentions three different opinions. One opinion is that this vine, this shoot, whatever you want to call it, was actually from Gan Eden, from the Garden of Eden. And according to the Medrash, there's discussion in the Medrash, what type of tree was the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, which Adam Harishon, with which Adam Harishon sinned. And according to the Gemara in Brachas also mentions many opinions, but the Gemara concludes, very strange, that it was a grain tree, a tree that produced grain. Okay, I understand the questions are quite obvious, but from the Medrash it seems that the majority of opinions mentioned in the Medrash was that it was a vine. The Eitz Hadas was a vine, and the tree of knowledge was a vine, and so the Zohar cites an opinion that the vine that Noach planted was a vine from the Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge.
That's Rabbi.
That Adam planted, that caused Adam to sin, that caused death for mankind. That's one opinion. And the Zohar says that according to that opinion, in the sense, Noach was committing the same sin as Adam Harishon did. But there was another opinion that also said that the vine was from the Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge. But it said, it's very strange, and perhaps there is a message there for our generation, that it was not his intention. He says, whereas Adam Harishon intended on eating from the Eitz Hadas, Adam intended on eating not just once, but continuously from the Eitz Hadas. Noach only wanted to check it out, the Eitz Hadas, and to use it maybe only one time. And in that one time, he wanted to perhaps use the Eitz Hadas to investigate the Eitz Hadas, in the sense almost like a scientist, but on a spiritual level. And to use the Eitz Hadas, if I could use a word that is misused today, for tikkun olam, to fix the world. And of course, he was not allowed to do that. But very often, when we have these noble ideas of tikkun olam, we sometimes resort to methods that are not proper and that are not allowed. And the Zohar says that the intention was a good intention, but it implies the action that Noach did was not proper. And in a sense, we could understand it. The Rambam, in Moreh Nevuchim, he says that a certain philosopher asked him a question that every thinking individual should ask. And that question is that it seems that Adam Harishon, Adam and Eve, were rewarded from the simple reading of the Psukim, rewarded for the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge. Because the Torah tells us that as a result of eating from this tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve became Yodea Tov v'Ra. They became knowledgeable in good and bad, implying that before they ate from the tree of knowledge, they did not have a perception of good and bad. So in a sense, they were in a higher madrega, a higher level, as a result of eating from the tree of knowledge, because they had knowledge of good and bad to distinguish between good and bad, to understand good and bad. How could they be rewarded for the sin of not listening to God? And the Rambam says that before the sin, man, the Adam Harishon, Adam, was Yodea Emes v'Sheker. He knew true and false. After the sin, his perspective of thinking changed from true and false to good and bad. And the question is, and everybody raises this question, now what is true and false? Where do we apply true and false? When it comes to science, when it comes to mathematics, we apply true and false. We don't say a triangle has 180 degrees, that's good. We say that's true. And if someone says a triangle has 120 degrees, that's false. It's not bad. If one says there is gravity, there's a law of gravity, it's true. It's not good. And if one says there is no law of gravity, then it's false. It's not bad. So true and false are used when it comes to science and mathematics. Good and bad is used when we talk about morality. It's good to be nice to people. It's good to help people. It's good not to kill. It's good not to steal. It's bad to steal. It's bad to kill. So the Rambam is saying that Adam Rishon, before he sinned, he was a mathematician and a scientist. But after he sinned, he somehow went down to a lower level. He became a moralist. How are we to understand it? And I think the simple answer, this answer I heard from my father. I heard from my father that before Adam Rishon sinned, it's not that he had no moral perspective, but he viewed morality in the same manner that he viewed science and mathematics. It wasn't that he viewed morality, you shouldn't kill because you shouldn't kill. You shouldn't steal because you shouldn't steal. It's not because it's good not to steal. It's not because it's good not to kill and that it's bad to kill. It was because you shouldn't kill. And in a sense, this is the halachic approach. The halachic approach is that we observe the mitzvos because that was the command of God. It is because it is. Now it's true, there is no doubt that stealing and killing is bad for society. But as Reb Chaim said, and I mentioned it last week, Istakel b'toraso u'barolamo. God used the Torah as his blueprint in creating the world. In other words, what is good for society, what is good for mankind, very often coincides with what the Torah requires of us. But it's not because it's good for society the Torah requires it of us, but it's just the opposite. Because God wanted those laws in the Torah when he created the world. He created the world in such a manner that it should coincide with what he wanted to be the mitzvos of the Torah, the laws of the halacha. Now, so in a sense, and the truth is, so what it is as a result of the sin, man's perspective of morality, there was a wedge created between science and mathematics on one hand, and morality on the other hand. And when you view morality from the perspective of good and bad, very often a person can have his own lists of people who wouldn't, in his mind, wouldn't be so bad if they were harmed. But if it's based on emes v'sheker, if it's based on the rule of law of God, then it's based on true and false and not in good and bad. And it's this change of the perspective of morality that affected man as a result of the sin. And in a sense, when you have the attitude that I'll do it only one time because it's necessary, because I can make tikkun olam, I can fix the world. Somehow investigating the Eitz Hadas, Noach felt, and using it. By evaluating it and understanding it, because the Eitz Hadas was tov v'ra. It was both good and bad. So he was trying to see how the Eitz Hadas could be used only for good. So if he had the approach of emes v'sheker, of true and false, irregardless of what he thought could have happened, he wouldn't have done it. But unfortunately, Noach misunderstood the lesson of the Eitz Hadas, and he viewed it from the perspective of tov v'ra, from the perspective of good and bad. But we still have to understand it according to the other opinion, the opinion that he took the shoot, that he took the shoot and he did the same thing. He had the same intentions that Adam Arishon had. He wasn't doing it to make it tikkun olam. How is it that he could commit this blunder? Noach is tzaddik, tamim haya b'dorosam. He certainly knew that death came to the world as a result of Adam's sin. So why did he commit the same blunder? Now, also, the Mekubalim, some of the Baalei Machshava, they say a strange comment, and they quote a Zohar. It could be, there is a Zohar that says it. I looked up in the Zohar. I could see how someone could read it into the Zohar. But Noach is identified with Shabbos. Now, in Kabbalah. And the question is, now perhaps we can understand it because according to Chazal, at the end of Parshas, Rashi, I think, brings it down, that as a result of the eating of the Eitz Hadas, man plowed and planted, everything was with his hands. And Noach came and he invented tools. So in a sense, Noach gave rest to man. And Shabbos is a day of rest. So perhaps we could understand why Noach is identified with Shabbos. And what we see from here, but I think it's much more than that. Because Shabbos was not just created for man to rest, but Shabbos has a spiritual perspective also. Shabbos has a spiritual perspective also. And since Shabbos has a spiritual perspective, so we have to understand, how is Noach identified? Why is Noach identified with Shabbos? The Avos, the patriarchs, they're identified with Yontif. Avram is identified with Pesach, Yitzchak with Shavuos, Yaakov with Sukkot. But what is the connection between Noach and Shabbos? Now, we clearly see, though, we do see that Noach, as I mentioned, he invented tools. Why? We could suggest that Noach dedicated his life, even before the Mabul, to the idea of easing the curse or negating part of the curse that HaKadosh Baruch Hu placed on Adam, on mankind. The creation of tools made it easier to grow things, to plant things. So it's possible to suggest that Adam wanted somehow to negate the impact of the Eitz Hadas. But we have to understand this. We have to understand, how is Noach identified with Shabbos? Now, I mentioned that when Noach, and he was in his stupor, in his drunken state, so Chum and Canaan, they made fun of him. He was naked, and they made fun of him. And Chum went, and he told his brothers, Shem and Yafes. Shem is the ancestor of the Jewish people, and Yafes is the ancestor of the Greek nation. And he told them about Noach's drunkenness and how Noach is naked. And they, out of respect to their father, they went into Noach's tent and they put their heads to the side, not to look, out of respect for Noach, not to look at his nakedness. And they placed clothes over Noach. And the Medrash says, it's clear from the Medrash, that Shem, the ancestor of the Jewish people, he initiated this action, but Yafes went along with him. And as a result of this, Shem was rewarded with the mitzvah of tzitzis, of talis, and Yafes was rewarded with burial. There's a Medrash says he merited to get, there's one text in the Medrash that says he merited to get burial in Eretz Yisrael, but most of the texts say he merited to get burial because later on in the war of Gog and Magog, the Greek, the Gog, who was an ancestor of Greece, will die, and he will be buried. And some say he'll be buried in Eretz Yisrael. He'll be buried in Eretz Yisrael, and this was as a reward for what Yafes joining Shem. We have to understand, why is it that there were two different types of rewards given? Whereas Shem is given the mitzvah of tzitzis, of talis, and Yafes is rewarded with burial. But there's another question. And that question is that at the time when Avram went in the war between the 5 kings and the 4 kings, and he saved the king of Sodom. And the king of Sodom said, "V'rechush kach loch, tein li hanefesh, give me the people, but you take the physical belongings." And Avram said, "I won't take anything, not even a string will I take, or a piece of leather, or a shoestring, not a string of cloth and not a shoestring. I will not take from you, because you shouldn't say, Ani has sharti as Abraham. You shouldn't be in a position to say, I gave Avram everything." In other words, to Avram, it was important. Yes, Avram was successful. He acquired lots of wealth, but it was all due to God, and no other person should be able to take credit for it. And Avram was concerned that the king of Sodom will say that he is the one that made Avram wealthy. So as a result of that, the Medrash says Avram was given the mitzvah of tzitzis and the mitzvah of tefillin. So we seem to have a contradiction here.
Why do we have a mitzvah of tzitzis? Is it because of Shem? Because of what Shem did on behalf for Noach? Or is it because of what Avram did in his dealings with the king of Sodom? Now we could suggest that, well, Shem had a lot of other descendants. So Shem acquired the mitzvah of tzitzis for his descendants. But that the chosen one of the descendants should be the Jewish people, that was because of Avram. But I want to suggest another answer. Now, my uncle, in explaining why Shem, what was the difference between Shem's approach and Yafes's approach? He said Shem was interested in snius, in modesty. The shame was the lack of modesty. When Noach undressed himself, when he acted in a drunken state, so there was a lack of modesty, obviously, and that's why Shem put the cloths over him. But Yafes, he had a different approach altogether. Yafes, and my uncle didn't. My uncle said Yafes was. My uncle used the Yiddish term. It was nicht schön. It was not nice. What Noach was doing wasn't nice. He wasn't concerned about the trait of modesty. Modesty is an internal trait and it has external manifestations. Yafes was only concerned about how things looked. And it's very interesting. I was troubled about this. Now, my uncle didn't explain. I'm going to suggest an explanation. Perhaps he meant this. Perhaps he didn't mean this. But Noach was the Greeks. Look at all the statues of the Greeks. All the Greek statues have talk of people who were in the Olympic Games, but nakedness seemed to be a positive quality by the Greeks. So all of a sudden, Yafes wants to cover it. The chain, as my uncle says, it's not nice. How are we to understand it? But the answer is, if Noach wasn't in a drunken stupor, then it might have been okay. That was the Greek way to show off. But because he was in a drunken stupor, the nakedness added to the shame. That's why Noach, that's why Shem covered him up. Why? What is the inyan of tznius, of modesty? We cover ourselves up. And it emanates from a certain sense of smallness, not smallness in a bad way. I'm not talking about the internal feelings of somebody who's a borderline suffers from a borderline personality. I'm talking about smallness, that not wanting to be, just the opposite, not wanting to be the center of attention, not desiring to be the center of attention. Where does modesty come from? What does tznius come from? Hatzne leches. You know you're in the presence of God. And by the way, the presence of God is, we're close to God. And to a certain degree, God is part of us, according to most Mekubalim.
The neshama, the soul of man, which is the soul, is a chelik elokai mima'al. It's godliness that is attached to us. Some say in us, some say attached to us. But we're always in the presence of God. So that's what tznius is. The Greeks, it wasn't that we were in the presence of God. It was show off. And if a person didn't look proper, then they wanted him covered up. They wanted him hidden. Well, not so much covered up as hidden. And before the tzitzis and the talus, what does that represent? It's represented our servitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our closeness, our being attached to God. God is everywhere, and four corners represents everywhere. So because Shem understood the idea of tznius, the idea of being in the presence of God, because of that, he was rewarded with the mitzvah of tzitzis, which in a sense is covering ourselves up in the presence of God. And when do we wear a talus? Primarily a talus is worn when we daven, when we're standing, when we're omed lefnei hashchina, when we stand before God. That's when we wear the talus. Now, but the Greeks, they were rewarded with burial. Why were they rewarded with burial? Because they covered up Noach, because they felt the body was ashamed because of his drunkenness, his state of drunkenness. And the purpose of burial, certainly in their minds, is to hide the body from the shame of deterioration. Now, it's very interesting. My uncle said that he asked the question, and according to many Rishonim, so on the Talus Gadol, other answers are given also. On the Talus Gadol, on the Talus that we wear when we daven, so we make a bracha lehisate tzitzis. We cover ourselves with the tzitzis. But in the talus cotton, the small talus that we wear, that we put over our head, and we put our heads through it. Some wear it on top of the shirt, some wear it below the shirt. So we make al mitzvahs. Why the different brachas? Other answers are given. My uncle said that there are really two separate mitzvahs of tzitzis. One is in the Parsha Vayomer, and that's a mitzvah of covering oneself. It's an action. My uncle said there is an argument, there is one opinion in the Gemara. We don't follow that opinion, but there's an opinion in the Gemara that if one has a four-cornered garment, even when it's not wearing it, when the four-cornered garment is in the drawer, you need tzitzis on it. I wonder, those who say that you have to wear your talus cotton out, whether they, according to that opinion, feel that the tzitzis should hang out of the drawer also. But okay. So in any case,
but my uncle said that even according to the way we paskin, that you don't have to have tzitzis on clothes that are in the drawer that have four corners. But a garment, why is it? Because when it's in a drawer, it's not considered a garment. But the talis cotton that we wear, talis cotton, we wear it, but it doesn't cover us. A talis gadol covers us. It's katifas hayishmelim, like the Arabs wear the cloak. It's a cloak like the Arabs wear. But the talis cotton is not like a cloak that the Arabs wear. So there's a separate mitzvah of dilim tasalof. You have to put tzitzis on the clothes, but it's not a mitzvah of me wearing it. It's the clothes, the four-cornered garments that I have require tzitzis. But the reason I don't have to put it on the clothes in the drawer is because the clothes in the drawer are not garments at that moment. But let's say my uncle's mentioned that according to Rabbeinu Tam, if somebody else is wearing my tzitzis, I can make a bracha on it because it's my tzitzis. It's not the best thing to do, but it's my tzitzis. It's like someone, so I am fulfilling the mitzvah because my garment, when it's worn by somebody else, is still my garment. It's a garment and it belongs to me. So that's a separate mitzvah of tzitzis. My suggestion is that these two mitzvahs, so there we can't say lehisate for tzitzis. It's a mitzvah of cloaking yourself with tzitzis. There it's the garment requires tzitzis. The object requires tzitzis. But if it's not being worn, it's not a garment at that point. I want to suggest there are two separate mitzvahs of tzitzis. Noach, when they covered Noach, it was a covering. There's the mitzvah of a cloak, of a talis gadol. But Abraham, why did Abraham get it? Because he said, I don't want you to say, Ani shartius Abraham. I gave Abraham his clothes. No, God, everything Abraham has, God gave him. So the tzitzis at the end of the garments, and that's what Yaakov said, if God will be with me, and he'll watch over me in this road that I'm going, give me food to eat, and make a bracha for that. And clothes to wear. And I return we should demonstrate that God is our God. God is the one who gives us everything. When it comes to clothes, four-cornered clothes, so we demonstrate again at the four corners that represents God who is everywhere. He is the source of our clothes. He is the source of everything that we have. That's what Avram, that's the mitzvah of tzitzis that was brought by Avram. Now, and it's interesting. The Gemara talks and the Rambam mentions it, that when it comes to Shabbos, and this is only true about Shabbos, it's not about Yom Tov, a person should prepare
for Shabbos before Shabbos comes. And they give a number of examples. Some people would sit in their seat waiting for Shabbos to come. They would be all dressed up for Shabbos. People don't do it today. My grandmother used to do it. My grandmother, it made no difference how long or how short Friday was. Which before Shabbos, she was dressed for Shabbos completely, and she would sit in her seat saying Tehillim, waiting for the Shabbos to come, to welcome the Shabbos. The Shabbos coming, that's the Shekhinah. Now, the Shekhinah doesn't just join me for the meal, doesn't take a seat at the table. When the Shabbos comes, the Shabbos becomes, according to our sages, a neshama yesera, an additional soul. It's an additional soul. And there is a dispute. What does it mean, neshama yesera? An additional soul. Most Mefarshim learn it's not that there's an additional soul in the person on Shabbos, but a person is more sensitive to his soul. Shabbos offers the potential to be more sensitive to the presence of one's soul, of the chelek Elokai mimal, of the godliness in him on Shabbos. However, from the Baal Turim, it says, "V'yom hashvi shavas vayinafash." So vayinafash ends with a shin. Shabbos ends with a saf. Hashvi ends with a yud. Uvayom ends with a mem. Shtayim. So from the Baal Turim, it seems that there is actually an additional soul that associates itself with us, in Shabbos. So that comes part of us on Shabbos. But whatever it is, on Shabbos, so in a sense, when we go out to greet the Shabbos, we go out to greet the godliness that's coming to us. And the Medrash says, the Gemara says, that they would go out, some of them would go out in the fields, some would sit in their seat, as my grandmother did, for the Shekhinah to come. Some would go out to the fields to welcome the Shabbos. And when they went to welcome the Shabbos, they went with their talis on them. Why? Because when you meet God, the talis is the symbol of modesty. And it's the symbol of being tied to God, the symbol of being in the presence of God. And perhaps even more than that, the presence of God, of the possibility of God being in you. Now, what is the difference? Now, it's very interesting. There is an argument. What is the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov? There is an argument between the Rashbam and Tosfos. If there is only a neshama yesera on Shabbos, or there's a neshama yesera even on Yom Tov. The Rashbam in Psachim says that even on Yom Tov, there is a neshama yesera also, an extra soul. Tosfos says no, it's only on Shabbos. And we understand the Tosfos very well, because according to many in the Chachmei HaKabbalah, Vayinafash, on Shabbos, God became the soul of the world. So Shabbos is identified with the idea of godliness entering this world and entering in our lives and entering in our very being. But the Rashbam says even on Yontif there is an Neshama Yisera. Now we know when we make Havdalah at the end of Shabbos, we take psumim and we smell the psumim figuratively. Why do we smell the psumim after Shabbos? Because the neshama, according to many, the neshama Yisera leaves us that additional soul, that godliness, that additional sense of godliness leaves us. So figuratively, we feel faint, and we need the psakim, the psumim, to revive us. So Tosfos asks, according to the Rashbam, that there is an neshama Yisera, there's an additional soul on Yontif. Why don't we use psumim when we make Havdalah after Yontif is over? But I think the answer is very simple. It's based on something that my uncle said, but not in regard to this. There's a difference between Shabbos and Yontif. Shabbos, God comes to us. Yontif, we go to God. My uncle said, Yontif, you had Aliyah L'Regel, the whole thing was going to God. I think it's more than just that. Yontif, we proclaim Yontif. We proclaim the new month. We just did it this Shabbos. Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanin. God sanctifies the Jewish people who sanctified the new month. But when it comes to Shabbos, God proclaims the Shabbos. Mekadesh HaShabbos. There's not Mekadesh Yisrael v'Shabbos. God sanctifies the Shabbos directly. It's not through the Jewish people. So in other words, the difference between Shabbos and Yontif is Yontif, we go to God. Shabbos, God comes to us. Shabbos, God is our guest, if we want to call that. I don't like to use that word. Now, what I want to suggest is, and that's the reason why, according to the Rashbam, because figuratively on Shabbos, if God comes to us, God leaves us when Shabbos is over, so we feel faint, so we need the psumim. Yontif, we leave God. If we leave God, we can't say, I feel faint, I need the psumim. Okay, but Gan Eden, God made this restricted area, and he put man in that restricted area. In a sense, Gan Eden, now we sense God in nature. But the question is, in this world, is this world God's world or it's our world? God certainly created the world. But on the other hand, we said, Shemaim, we said, Shemaim Lashem, Ha'aretz Nasan L'fnei Adam. God gave the world to man. The Beis HaMikdash, in a sense, God took back. When we go to the Beis HaMikdash, we go to God's residence. I want to suggest that Gan Eden was God's place. When man lost the right to God's place, so he was thrown out of Gan Eden when man sinned. But now Noach, why did Noach do? Noach felt there was a difference between outside Gan Eden and inside Gan Eden. Gan Eden, he felt that was God's place, and man was a guest. But outside Gan Eden, outside the Garden of Eden, that was man's place for Ha'aretz Nasan L'fnei Adam. So he felt that over there, man had a right not only to plant the Eitz Hadas, but even to partake of the Eitz Hadas. Adam made a mistake, he felt. Adam's mistake was that Garden Eden, that was the property of God. But here in the outside world, everything was given to man. And it's very interesting. The Torah tells us at the beginning of Parshas Noach, Ela told us Noach is tzaddik, Tomim haya b'dorosav, es halakim is halech Noach. Noach walked with God, but by Avram it says, God told Avram, his halech b'fanai, the heye samim, walk before me. And the Medrash says, Noach needed God's help. He had to lean on God. Es halakim his halech Noach. God had to help Noach. Noach wasn't in a rush to get into the teva. God had to push him into the teva. And that was his general attitude. It's one of God coming to Noach. But Avram is constantly walking towards God. His halech lefanai beheyeh samim. That's the difference. In other words, Avram would go to God. Whereas when it came to Noach, God came to him. And that perhaps could be understood as the reason why Noach was the symbol of Shabbos, because Shabbos represents God coming to us. Whereas Yontef, and especially the Shlosha Regalim, that represents God going to us going to God. And as far as the Dor Haflaga is concerned, I'll just be very quick because I know it's late. As far as the Dor Haflaga is concerned, what was the difference between the generation of the Mabul, the generation of the flood, who were punished, and the generation of the Dor Haflaga? The generation of the flood, each person did whatever he wanted. They would kidnap women, whoever they chose. Each person did his own thing. They didn't care about anybody else. Dor Haflaga, on the contrary, Dor Haflaga was the unity of man. Now, unity can be a good thing, but unity could be a very bad thing. Just recently, I heard stupidity that people say that even though COVID is dangerous, we shouldn't come out telling people to take precautions if that goes against other segments within our community, because that goes against unity. I don't understand how people could say something so stupid. When there's a group that's doing something wrong, you have to separate yourself from that group. Especially when it comes to nefashos. So I think what the Dor Haflaga, matter of fact, the Medrash says if a brick fell down, the Medrash says, obviously it wouldn't take literally, they sat Shiva on the brick. But if a person fell down from the tower when they were building it, it was no problem. What's the idea? The individual had no importance. It was only the community. A brick, it was big bricks, to bring it up there required extra work. A person fell down, you had another person climb back up. It was a lot easier dealing with it. The individual lost his importance. The question is, why did the Dor Haflaga have that attitude? I think the reason the Dor Haflaga had that attitude, The Dor Haflaga figured what was wrong with the generation of the flood. The generation of the flood, each person was for himself. If we want to claim this land, we want to claim the world as belonging to man, it has to be as part of a union of mankind. But if each person is for himself, then they can't claim the land for themselves, and then it belongs to God. God gives us the land, but we have to take it. God told Adam Arishon, Adam represented mankind. The Kipshua conquered the land. But it has to be all of mankind. The Medrash says that Abram walked over most of the world, obviously through an S or whatever, to take the Medrash literally. But the idea was that he identified with the whole world. And he said any place that Abram didn't walk will never be settled. And the places where Abram walked were settled eventually. Where Adam walked, was settled, not Abram. So I think that this is the idea why the Dor Haflaga felt the generation of the flood, it wasn't mankind, it was each person separately. They didn't claim the land. If they didn't claim the land belonged to God. But the land belongs to us. And since the land belongs to us, we have rights. We have rights in the land. And we have rights to determine how we should act and how we should live our lives. And of course, this was the big mistake because there's a difference. First of all, it's ra, it's not good. But certainly from the perspective of emes v'sheker, when God gives us everything, but we have to submit ourselves to God in the same way as Abram submitted himself to God. In other words, it belongs to us, but it belongs to us only because we have a license from God to have it. And if we don't act properly, God could withdraw that license. Okay.
Okay, so please put questions in the chat. We have a couple questions. How could
Sure.
they go out to greet the Shabbos queen? Shabbos wearing a talis? Did they have tchelas?
So if they had tchelas, they went out with the tchelas. If they didn't have, so
I think according to the
so first of all, we could say we're talking about the Tanoims. They certainly had tchelas. That's the first thing. Secondly, we could talk about a place that it said they went out in the fields. In the fields, you could make an Erev. There's no shaila about that. So there is no problem about that. And then there is a machlokes from Yehuda and Chachamim as to whether tchelis is ma'akev as a lovin or not. So according to the opinion and the sheet of the Chachamim, the opinion of the Chachamim is that tchelis is not a prerequisite for tzitzis. Of course, if you have it, you're required to use it. But if you don't have it, so you don't need it. So it could be that those Tanoim, they felt like the Chachamim, not like Rabbi Yehuda.
Another question with Havdalah, why do we look at our fingernails or palms in the fire? Some say man's skin before being thrown out of Gan Eden.
It had to do with Adam Arishon, I think, because Adam Arishon, he's the one that and Adam Arishon originally apparently he had nails over his body. So we're sort of imitating the Adam Arishon. I think that's the reason it's given.
Could you please repeat what the Baal Turim said about the spelling of the Shenis?
Yes, because in the paragraph we say in the Shamru Neas as the Shabbos, the last words, Uvayom Hashvi Shavas Vayinafash. Now Vayinafash ends with a shin. Shabbos ends with a saf. Shvi ends with a yud. Uvayom ends with a mem. So if you read the last letters of the last 4 words of the parak of this parsha of the Shamru B'nai Yisrael, you have the word shtayim, 2. And the Baal term says this is where we know that there's an neshama yesera, there's an extra soul on Shabbos. So you see that he holds it's like 2 souls, not just that you feel the soul more. That's
and again,
in Chumash Shemos. In Chumash Shemos,
is it in Kisisa?
it's Perek Lamed Aleph.
Can you please repeat how the Dor Haflaga could sin even though Abraham was alive?
In other words, the Dor Haflaga felt you can say whatever you want about the Mabul, but it doesn't apply to us because we are in charge of the earth. God gave the world to man. Beforehand, because when man is unified, then the world belongs to man. There is this sense that if I do it as a group, I don't have to worry. We even have that sense today. When people are rioting, there's a certain sense that there's power in numbers, even over something that's wrong. It becomes right if there's a group that does it. Look at the trends in society today. The trends in society today, things that were considered terrible only a short while ago, today is considered exalted. Why? Because it's accepted by the masses. There's this sense that if it's a group, if it belongs to us, then the group has a right. We determine what is right and what is wrong, but one individual cannot determine what is right and what is wrong.
If Noach perceived that Hashem comes to us in our land, how could he have undressed himself when he was drunk?
Because
He was drunk?
Because he was drunk. That's exactly it. As a matter of fact, Noach wanted to see himself in a sense that he is not affected anymore by the sin of the Eitz Hadas. And in his drunken stupor, he might have imagined that. And that could have contributed to his undressing himself because he saw himself like Adam Arishon before the sin in his drunken stupor. Because he was focusing, his whole life was focusing, I forgot to mention that, his whole life was focusing on undoing the damage of the Eitz Hadas. So, and in his drunken stupor, he thought he might have accomplished that, and that's why he made himself naked in his tent.
Okay, there are no more questions. So thank you very much, Yeshua.